I remember I was 17 in grade 12 and I saw a police car drive past and pull up at the lights in the main street, and I looked at a police car and I thought, that's what I want to do. I went to a fatal car crash. I got into 3 fights with drink drivers. I got into a fight with a bikie at a nightclub. I went to a fatal caravan fire where a little child was killed in a caravan fire. And this was all my first week. I was getting very bitter and twisted about the world. I was very cynical, probably drinking too much.
It was a pleasure sitting down with a cop that had spent 30 years in Queensland Police and has come out with such a positive outlook on life. And he's paid his dues. He spent 30 years in the police, and 15 of those were in child protection, which is a really hard gig. Jack Roney is a very creative person. You can see in the way he talks, and what I admire about him most is the way that he's pursuing a passion. He's always had a dream to be a fictional crime writer, and that's what he's doing since leaving the police. And having sat down and spoken to him, I reckon he's got a great future. Jack Roney, welcome to I Catch Killers.
Thanks, Gary. It's my pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's good to have you here. Now, you've only recently, and when I talk recently, we're talking just late last year, where you left the Queensland Police.
Yeah, so I officially terminated in September last year. It was a big decision, I have to say. I was pretty much institutionalised. I joined the police straight out of high school. I was 18 years of age as a sworn-in police constable, and fast forward nearly 34 years, I decided to make the decision to see what I want to do when I finally grow up, and what's out there in life for me. So I took some time off to kind of make the decision what I want to do, and I got to sort of have a look outside the sort of the walls of the institution.
Yeah.
And I like what I saw, so I took a leap of faith, and here I am.
It's interesting you say that, and I speak to a lot of cops, and we talk about separation anxiety. Did you experience separation anxiety? Like your whole persona seems to be caught up in being a police officer, whether you like it or not. That's who you are and what you do. Have you experienced that separation anxiety?
I think I've gone through different phases of that, and that whole idea of loss of a sense of identity, because when it defines who you are for so long, and suddenly that's not part of you anymore, you feel like you're not part of the family. You're on the outer. So I definitely did have that. Those sort of feelings. I sort of come to the realisation that I miss the notion of policing more than I actually miss policing. I miss the idea of being part of the family and what that meant to me. And I felt I left at a time that I was still very positive about my job, but really for me it was just more about exploring what else life could offer. So certainly did it with mixed feelings, but when I finally made the decision, I felt very comfortable with that.
It's a good way to leave still with that positive feel for the job that you did or devoted your life to. So I think that's a beneficial way to walk away from it.
Yeah, and also the fact that I had something to go to. One of the primary drivers was the fact that I pursued this interest of writing, and for me, I had to make a decision. I'd immersed myself in writing crime fiction, and it was kind of, I suppose I was concerned about perceptions being a serving police officer and writing crime fiction, and as it turned out, I received a lot of support from my colleagues, but I had a lot of reservations and concerns and kept it secret, and it wasn't until I sort of finally came out and said, look, this is what I'm doing. So, but I had to make a decision. I can either I've got to do one or the other. I felt there was too much of a conflict of interest to do both.
Yeah.
And when I was offered a publishing deal, I thought, this is the universe and the planets have aligned, and this is telling me something. So my wife pretty much said, look, grow a set of balls and make a decision, and she was really supportive. And with the support of colleagues and friends and family, I made the decision to pursue my dream of being a writer.
She got sick of that person, that loser sitting on the fence going, oh me, oh my, I don't know what to do.
Absolutely.
Make a decision. Well, full credit to you. You're pursuing a passion, and policing's not easy. I've been out for 3 years, and I can say that each day it gets you step away that little bit further. You still have that part of the police officer inside you that will always be there. And you touched on an interesting thing there, that the idea of being a policeman is more what you were attracted to than actually being a policeman towards the end of your career. That hits me when I see a crime come out on, in the media or whatever. A crime happens, I think, I wish I was working on that. And it's that potential that you can make a difference at certain times. I think that's something that I struggle with. Does that make sense to you?
I definitely having to sort of show restraint and remind yourself, look, I'm a member of the public. I'm a citizen now. I'm not. I don't have that badge in my pocket. Sometimes you feel that empty space in your pocket. It's that badge isn't there anymore. So you have to show a bit of restraint because you are so used to, even though they say you're not on the job 24 hours a day, you kind of feel like that. And when that's suddenly not part of you anymore, it's certainly a strange feeling.
It is a strange feeling, and I'm happy to report I haven't made any citizens arrests since I've left the police. But when you are, a police officer, quite often you have to step into a situation you see escalating when you're out in public, and you just, you pull the badge and try to sort the situation out peacefully. And I've seen a couple of incidents where if I still was a policeman, I'd step in, but now you sort of you've got to stand back and think, okay, well that's not my role anymore.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept that, I've been in situations where, say, for example, commuting into the city on a train in uniform, and because you're like a beacon and everyone's looking at you, if you've got some clown turns up and they're drunk and they're hassling other passengers, you've got to step in. There's that expectation. But I guess that the decision is around it. What would a reasonable person do anyway? If a normal good person would intervene, you still would.
You still would.
But yeah, you're right. It is you sort of have to make that decision. Is this something I'm seeing something unfold in front of me, and a decent person would step in? It's the right thing to do. You're probably still going to, and you've always got that in your veins anyway. I think
that's a good measure. But you brought back some memories because I did a lot of commuting on trains, and the amount of times I got tied up in stuff where I just wanted to sit on the train, fall asleep, or read a book.
Yes,
and
exactly.
All of a sudden you got someone under arrest. But anyway,
yeah.
A couple of your career in the police, and we'll break it all down. But there was, in talking to you, there was a couple of heavy cases that you worked on, and one that, because I've been in homicide a long time, but the way you were describing the case was, it's very, very heavy situation where some children had seen their parents murdered, and you had to interview the children, debrief the children. Do you want to just talk about that briefly? Yeah,
it's interesting. After we had a conversation the other day, and we're talking about what are some memories and jobs you worked on, and that one certainly comes to mind, and there's others, and I've sort of been pondering. You sort of have a bit of a repressed memory. There's a lot of things. Just in the last couple of days, I've been thinking, and all these old memories are starting to resurface. Things that I had intentionally put aside. The case you're referring to, it was a double homicide. A husband and wife were killed, shot and killed inside their own home. A person had come in, and effectively it was a home invasion. It was a deliberate hit on those people. I got called in to assist the lead investigation team, and because I was with the child protection unit, my job with other detectives was to interview these kids, and there were 7 kids in the family. Both husband and wife had kids from other relationships, so it was a mixed family.
That's a confronting crime. 7 children, you said, witness parents being murdered. What age range?
Yeah, those kids ranged from about 8 years of age to 12 years of age.
Oh, that's just a horrendous age for them to witness that or be involved in something like that.
So I sort of got drawn into that and started to form a close bond with those kids and sort of got drawn into the overall investigation as well. But my primary focus was making sure that the kids were protected and we were catering for their needs, but they were also crucial eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
So the role was to interview those kids, and in that role we received specialist training in order to, because a fundamental part of our job is interviewing child victims and witnesses. And these kids had seen their parents being killed. And there was this one really poignant moment where we had these kids in our office. It was a home lookalike room that we just set up for, it's got teddy bears and it's a sort of a soft interview room. And it occurred to me one of the kids had blood all over his feet. And I just remembered he was only about 8 or 9, I think, just a little fella. And I said, how about we go down and we'll clean your feet, eh? And so I he took my hand and I walked him down the hallway and put him up on the bathroom basin and washed his dead parents' blood off his feet. And it was kind of this really powerful moment, watching sort of almost the blood swirling down the sink and cleaning this little boy's feet. That stuck with me. That was quite a powerful experience for me, to form this bond with these kids so quickly because they look to us for kind of protection, given what they just experienced.
Yeah, I can understand why that would stick with you. That is a very heavy situation, and also in the way you describe the role, there's the welfare issues and looking after the child's emotional welfare, but you also have that role of you've got to extract information from them too, and that's conflicting sometimes as well, isn't it? You just want to give the kid a cuddle and help them as get through it, but you also have that responsibility to try and get information from them.
Yeah, you click into being very task focused. Our task is to see what these kids know. We need to interview the kids in a way that what disclosures they make are going to be admissible in court. So the way in which you ask the questions have to be very non-leading and always at the time thinking we have nothing else at this point. What these kids tell us could be quite important. So there's a lot of pressure to get it right.
Yeah. Any idea how they're coping now?
Yeah, you do tend to. I have sort of checked in on them over the time, but you do lose track. So it's hard to know how that's impacting. I've often wondered, how has that impacted on them as adults now.
I tend to stay away from victims' families unless they seek me out, because I'm mindful that I represent probably one of the worst experiences they've had in life. So it's sort of it's hard. You don't want to impose on people and stay in contact with them unless they feel comfortable.
Yeah, you do lose contact with people. You become so immersed in their life for so long. For example, I remember a young couple who lost their child to sudden infant death, and my baby was the same age, and I really got to know those people, that couple, quite well. But over time, at some point, you kind of have to separate that relationship, and you do lose track of those people.
Step away. Okay, why did you join the police?
It's funny. I grew up in Toowoomba, is my hometown in Queensland, and I remember I was 17 in grade 12, and I saw a police car drive past and pull up at the lights in the main street, and I looked at a police car and I thought, that's what I want to do. I had no police in my family. I didn't know any police. I was going to go to university straight out of high school. I'd already been accepted, but I just had this thing that I wanted to join the police. And back then, Queensland Police had a cadetship where you could join straight out of high school. So I started at the police academy in 1988 as a 17-year-old. So I got accepted, and pretty much I was lucky to be living my dream, and got sworn in as a conconstable still at the age of 18. I hadn't yet turned 19.
It's young, isn't it?
It's very young.
You're a dead set baby.
Yeah, so my three kids, I've got three kids, 26, 22, and my baby's 19. And I look at him now and think, I was younger than you, and I was walking around with a gun on my hip. So we had to learn.
Scary thought.
It's pretty scary. We had to learn and mature very quickly because you're just exposed to stuff that 18, 19-year-olds are not normally exposed to. So I did my first few years as a general duties patrol officer and moved around a bit, Toowoomba and Brisbane, and then started working in other locations around Queensland. And then fairly early on in my career, I got the opportunity to relieve in plain clothes in what was referred to as the Juvenile Aid Bureau, and the focus was sort of youth crime, and started to touch on the child protection. And I kind of just, I think I was drawn to it. I think I was suited to that sort of work, and then that's where my career sort of followed that direction.
That's where the bulk of your career. Those early days in uniform, as a 18, 19-year-old, still wet behind the ears. You've been through the academy, but that can only teach you so much, and then they throw you out on the street. Did you see yourself change as a person from the experiences there? Like, you look at your mates, and I felt when in the police very early, and you're out and you sort of look at your friends, what used to be the, serious stuff you thought you were discussing, then you see what you do at work, and it sort of changes you. Did you go through that?
Yeah, very much so. When I saw what my old schoolmates were doing, they were going to uni or had jobs, and I was, would share with them some of the things I'd been through. Even the first week, I think my first week in the job, I'll never forget my first week. I was thrown straight onto night work. It was Toowoomba. It was cold. It was in the middle of winter. I went to a fatal car crash. I got into 3 fights with drink drivers. I got into a fight with a bikie at a nightclub. I went to a fatal caravan fire where a little child was killed in a caravan fire. And this was all my first week. I think I had more fights and cuts and abrasions in my first week than I did for the remainder of my service. They literally threw me at everything to get experience. So that's that's where the experience and maturity came.
Basically, toughen you up and roughen you up a little bit.
Absolutely.
This is the world. But that type of experience. Did you have any "what am I doing" moments? Did you think maybe this isn't the right thing for me?
No, I didn't. I think for me, because we were so young, we were at the academy for a year and a half.
Yeah.
The cadetship was an extended period, and that gave us plenty of time to be institutionalised, to have it drilled into us. And so we had real expectations of what to expect. And I think we were quite prepared for what to expect. And it's what I wanted to do. It was just exciting. It was just so exciting. And you just, and I was only a little fella, but I was like a little bull terrier. And I felt I had to prove myself because I didn't have the physical size, and I'd be getting into all tussles and fights and blues. And with every one of those, you come out with more confidence, even if you might get knocked on your backside a few times. So for me, it was just an exciting journey. I suppose as the years go on, and particularly as I started working in the child protection area, that's when it starts to strip away at you and wear you down.
Take its toll.
Yeah.
I think, and I see the excitement on your face, and it's bringing a smile to my face, thinking of every day was an adventure early in the police, wasn't it? Like you described your first week. That's the type of stuff you were looking for. You'd start night shift and think, I hope it all happens tonight, and you get amongst it. So
yeah, but the question you ask around, did I start to question it? Yes, I did start to have those doubts and questions, probably maybe 15, 18 years into my career, when I was really caught. I felt I was caught in this between a rock and a hard place with this job I was doing. I felt I had a responsibility to my local community. I felt I couldn't show weakness. I was an officer in charge, so I had subordinates under me, and I just felt I had no escape. And I didn't realise how much toll the job was having on me at that point. And that was probably the first time I really started asking questions around, is this for me? I either need to bail because the burnout's going to get to me, or I've got to make some significant changes. I did have some thoughts about leaving the police back then.
Okay, the fact that you can recognise it is an important thing, because I've seen a lot of mates that have burnt out, and you can see it when you step away and you're looking at it, but when you're involved so closely as the individual, you can see them starting to burn out. It's just everything is just becoming, all the warning signs, all the red flags are there. But the fact that you sort of recognise it, I think is a good thing, and helps you, that you understand that you're spiralling into this area.
Yeah, it is a spiral, and the burnout sneaks up on you. You don't see it happen. It doesn't happen one day. It's a slow. It grinds away slowly, and sometimes you don't pick up on the warning signs. And I was getting very bitter and twisted about the world. I was very cynical. Probably drinking too much. The self-medication and having a few beers after work was something we all did. And but I certainly did find myself getting into quite a fairly dark place. And it's interesting. We'll probably talk about it later. But when I read what I started writing, when I started writing my first book, and I read it now, I think, my God, I was in a dark place. Yeah. Because I'm really expressing how I felt.
Yeah, I do get it. And like the area that you were working in, the area I worked in homicide, you don't see much joy in the world when you go to work. And I would quite often think, I just wish I had a job where I made people happy instead of, because if my good day, I'm going to someone's going to be crying or someone's going to be upset. That was the reality of the work that you did. Very similar to child protection, if not more. I think it's horrific, some of the things that you guys and girls have to see and deal with on a daily basis. Yeah,
and it's a thankless task, and really, for me, I have to, it's a big shout out to the guys and girls that are still out there doing the job, particularly the child protection work. I think it's a thankless task. There was a time when I think we were sort of undervalued. We were sort of almost referred to as the inferior detectives, which always got under my skin, because as far as I was concerned, we were dealing with child victims, and we had specialist expertise in interviewing children who'd been victims of horrific offences. And then we'd then sit down and eyeball the suspect, and then we would then interview and arrest the adult offender. So we had to sort of have skills in both.
Yeah.
So, I did that line of work for 14 years, and, as I said, there was that burnout. I know other colleagues who are still doing that work. So even though I felt my race was run in that line, but there's still people out there doing it.
Full credit to them. We were talking the other day when we were talking about it, and I said my observation is very similar to what you just said. It was undervalued, and it wasn't appreciated what was being done. And we're trying to work out why, because it's such a serious offence, but it's an offence that's not talked about readily publicly. Child abuse or anything to do with children, people are uncomfortable talking about it. It didn't get the media. So command structure wasn't, they weren't answering to the media what's happening to this. And it's almost like it got forgotten, sadly.
Yeah, and it's the sort of work that doesn't make the headlines.
Yeah.
If you're not out arresting people for homicide, or the big profile case of armed robberies, we were dealing with stuff where there was privacy issues and families, and dealing with the Department of Children's Services and a whole lot of other social issues with these families. It's a slow grind under the radar, and I think there was a period where we were undervalued, but then I think there was a real shift. Here in Queensland, in Queensland, it was went from the Juvenile Aid Bureau. We were often commonly referred to as the bum smackers, dealing with juvenile offenders.
Yeah.
And then they changed the name to the Child Protection Investigation Unit, which really truly reflected the core work that we were doing, which was fundamentally protecting kids. There's a lot of crossover between youth crime and child protection, but in the end, most of the work that we're doing was the child protection work.
It's when you say that crossover, and you look at youth crime, and invariably you look where the problem starts, and it starts because of in those early years, and they're running and don't have that stable home and all that. That would have been something that you're confronted with on a daily basis. Is that part of what changed your view on the world, or your dark view on the world?
Yeah, your sense of normal is pretty skewed, because I would just talk about, I've got another childish job today. The Department of Child Safety has rung us up. I remember some days I did 3 or 4 different jobs with the Department of Child Safety in one day.
And so describe a job. When you say that, describe the typical job.
So the typical job could be the department will contact us saying they've had a notification a child has turned up to school with a black eye, allegations that something has happened at home, so we'd have to go out and do a school visit, interview the child, go and visit the family, and then it was always a lot of trepidation, not knowing what you're going to walk into, and if there's violence in the home, so then having to go to the family home is probably almost the dangerous part of the job. And what are we going to do with this child? Is this child going to be walking back into? Have we inflamed the situation for the child? Or then you could have. I've had a number of walk-ins where, say, a mum walks in to the front counter of the police station with her daughter, saying, "My daughter's just disclosed that she's been indecently assaulted by someone within the family or someone that's known to them," and then have to interview the child and then commence up an indecent dealing investigation. And these things just happen. The phones are ringing. For me, it was relentless. It wasn't so much the nature of the work. I felt I coped with the nature of the work. It just never stopped. It was just every day, every time the phone rang, you could always bet it was going to be a new job.
I could never comprehend how many cases detectives in child protection would be running simultaneously. And it was always felt like it was under-resourced. I don't know if I think it has been improved, as we touched on, that it is, the value of the work is starting to be recognised. But going to one job like that after another, and the thing that is really scary, you've got to make an assessment that, do we remove this child, or is this child at risk? They're the hard calls. How do you live with that if you make the wrong call and say, no, we'll leave the child there?
Yeah, it's you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, and we would labour over these decisions a lot. Have we made the right decision to return this child home? Because if you make the decision in conjunction with the Department of Children's Safety to remove the child, then you're going to be criticised for removing a child from their family home.
Yeah.
And you're going to have the family are going to be angry at you, and or if you make the decision to return the child and something else happens, you're going to be criticised for failing to take action. So it's a really hard decision, and there's so many different shades of grey, and you just got to look at what are the facts. Sometimes you'll have to allow a child to go back into a situation which you know is not ideal.
It's the lesser of two evils.
Yes.
Yeah, I hate those decisions. They're the tough decisions. When you're in that field, the experience you get after 14 years to make those decisions, did that help you, the body of knowledge that you had and the wealth of knowledge that you'd come from years and years of experience? Did you think you're a better detective the longer you spent in that field?
I think so. Sometimes it tended to make you a little bit sort of complacent. As I said, it was my norm. People would say, I don't know how you can do this job. Whereas I would just be very methodical, look at the process, look at the evidence, and have to make a sort of fairly calculating decision. But you'd always get involved with the families, and there'd be emotions, and you couldn't help but sort of not so much get clouded, but get influenced by what's going on in the family, what's the family dynamics, and what's the best decision to make. You draw on your experiences. I still look back and think I probably made mistakes. I gave the wrong advice, or I made poor decisions. Yeah. You're under pressure as well, workloads and everything else, or overtime restrictions, and so sometimes you don't get it right, and they're the ones that keep you awake at night.
And the pressure of when you're overworked, I can imagine if you get a report and you're just about to knock off, and then that bloody phone rings and you pick it up and, I'm not going home. The temptation, you've because of the serious nature of the work, you feel obliged to just carry on. Even if overtime wasn't signed off on, I would imagine there would have been plenty of times, well, I'll just do the job anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of those jobs would come in at 5 to 4 in the afternoon, and you've got briefs of evidence to do and other paperwork, and these jobs walk in and they become your priority. And I think my wife, she was very understanding, and she just got used to the fact that I'll see you when I see you. I had young kids at the time, and that was my world for all those years.
How were you when you came home?
I was exhausted. My wife was understanding in that she wouldn't sort of press me or ask me questions. I might have, things like been a lot of suicide cases. Either I had some offenders that I'd arrested for child sex offenders had gone and committed suicide, and I went to those scenes, or even young offenders had committed suicide, or sudden infant death investigations where I had to...
They're tough.
Yeah, very tough. Even though it might be non-suspicious, it still requires some element of investigations where you've got a traumatised parents in hospital holding their deceased baby and having to encourage them to hand over the baby so that certain processes could be followed. So when that's your norm and you come home, I would just switch off, and I would spend a lot of time being very quiet. And sometimes we'd start talking with other people or friends, and she'd say, you never told me about that job that you did. And I said, I just didn't feel like talking about it when I came home. So I spent a lot of time, I was very inner, very withdrawn. I'd not talk a lot. And again, I think that leads to why I started writing. That was my way to start expressing how I was feeling and all the stuff I was carrying around, because I found it very hard to verbalise and articulate that.
That's interesting. So you're bottling it all up inside because you don't feel that you want to talk about it, but put it down on paper, and it's releasing some of the pressure.
Yeah, and I don't think I realised that was what I was doing at the time. When I look back retrospectively and think, clearly I felt the need to do that. Some people might have laughed and thought it was a bit of a wankery thing to do, to be writing crime fiction as a serving detective, but for me it was my kind of release. And some people might write diaries or memoirs, and I kind of looked at that, but I thought, for me, writing it in a fictional setting gives that one sort of point of difference or separation. But I could still tell the truth around the way I was feeling. There's a quote that I remember from an author by the name of Neil Gaiman, and he says, "Fiction is the truth that tells the fiction is the lie that tells the most truth."
That's a interesting quote. Fiction is the lie that tells the most truth. So, as a cop, we are bundled into very factual in how we report things and statements that we do. So as a creative writer, that gives you a little bit more freedom?
It does. It gives you that little bit more freedom to kind of feel safer about what you're writing. I've often had people say to me, "Oh, you're writing about such and such," and I'll say, "Look, it's all fiction. It's all stuff that's going on in my head that's been inspired by real situations." But
that's a safe word, isn't it?
Yes,
inspired.
Inspired.
Yep.
And look, you see a lot of stuff on TV and Netflix series where they're clearly based on factual events, but there's that little bit of fiction that's just, I think there's different shades of grey as far as what is meant to be factual and what is meant to be fictional.
Yeah.
But for me, it was very much an amalgamation of a lot of my own experiences, and I kind of weaved them together to create an interesting and engaging plot that hopefully people that like reading crime fiction will still enjoy to read. It's a good yarn, bit of action and suspense and mystery and all that. But for me, I wanted to pour in some authenticity around what's it really like to be a detective, and using my fictional character Jared O'Connor as my voice about what I felt was the truth around the world.
It's easier to explain your emotions when you're talking through a fictional character, isn't it?
It is.
You've used the word when we were talking before the podcast about it's a release for your creative side. Did you consider yourself a creative detective?
I would like to think so. I would like to think I was one of those people that would always think outside the box. And I was very fortunate that I got to work by myself a fair bit in terms of I was given a fair bit of autonomy.
Yeah.
So you do have to be quite creative, working smart with limited resources, and having to spend ages tracking down witnesses and following the breadcrumbs to try and find out. I remember there was a particular job where someone was taking pot shots with a rifle at cars, and a couple of cars got hit. Thankfully, no one got hurt, but we didn't know who was doing it, and it took me a couple of days of door knocking and speaking to some of these youth offenders that I'd sort of gotten to know over the years, and they started to trust me enough to give me information.
Yeah.
And it was through talking to all these kids and door knocking and following leads, a name surfaced, and then we knew who we were focusing on. So I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed the kind of the hunt to try and catch the person that you weren't sure who was responsible. I mean, those sort of jobs weren't always the case where you didn't know who it was. Usually you had a pretty good idea of who your good suspects were. But I enjoyed that part of it.
There is that creative side to policing, and I liked working with people that I considered creative in their thinking. Like you'd be at a roadblock on an investigation and someone had come up with an idea, and you use the term thinking outside the square. You need that to get the breakthroughs sometimes. But police being police as a culture, and we're going to talk about culture in part 2 in your writing, but police as a culture, it's very black and white in their thinking. And so to be a creative person, and you said you had concerns about even letting on the fact that you're a fictional crime writer, you might get ridiculed. There is a little bit of, I won't say narrow-mindedness because I don't think it's the right term, but that black and white thinking, that concrete thinking in police. This is the way we do it, and we don't step out. Would you care to comment about that?
Yeah, I have seen that. Sometimes I think it can lead us to draw conclusions too quickly.
Yep.
Instead of looking at what's presenting itself. If you go to a crime scene or a particular job, it's not always what it might first seem. And I think if you go in there with preconceived ideas, I think that's something we do become guilty of, or we follow our instincts. I'd like to think that most of the time our policing instincts are right. Your spider senses tingle, and you just have to follow that instinct. But occasionally you do have to keep an open mind and think, well, maybe it's not exactly what it is, and have I gone down a rabbit hole and I haven't kept an open mind about things.
So that's a voice of an experienced detective, I think, because the longer you stay in the job, the more you realise sometimes things aren't the way they appear to be at first.
Yes.
And also instinct, and people love to hear cops say, yeah, I've got this instinct, and if you've been doing this, you have an instinct. The instinct might be there because of all the depth of experience, but you've got to overlay that thought process with the facts, and you've got to be careful that you don't go off chasing a rabbit down a hole and ignoring the facts.
Yeah, and I think one good example of that, I do some external teaching around investigations, and interviewing is one example where the difference between doing an interrogation and an interview. If you go into an interview with a suspect or who you believe is the suspect, and you've already formed your own opinion about who's done what, and all you want is that confession. And if you go in with the blinkers on, you're going to miss things. You're going to miss other information that they give you, and maybe there's other suspects you might need to look at. So it's that whole thinking of what an interrogation versus an interview. Where an interrogation is about getting the confession at all costs, even if it might be a bit of a dodgy confession, versus an interview where the whole goal of the interview is to establish the truth and keeping an open mind.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I think there needs to be flexibility in your thinking when you are in the interview room. That I've seen police as they're learning, and you learn your skills as it goes along, but would prepare for the interview but weren't actually listening to what the person was saying in the answers. They'd have a very detailed interview prep with 100 questions, and they'd ask the questions but weren't actually listening to what the person was saying.
Yeah, it's a real skill to actually listen to their responses and picking up on non-verbal cues and things where you need to probe further. As you say, if you've pre-scripted your interview, you're not going to pick up on things. So that's where the real skill in interviewing comes, and that only comes through experience.
Yeah. Okay, can I take you back to what we talked about at the start of the podcast, that horrendous investigation that you're working on where the children's parents were murdered in front of them? You said that was part of the catalyst for when you decided you wanted to get away from the type of work that you're doing within the police, not leave the police, but just move into another field of policing. Talk us through that.
Yeah, I think I went through a period probably for about 18 months where I felt unhappy,
Yeah.
and it was just gnawing away at me, and going to work was a real effort. And then that's when the early signs of burnout was starting to there, and I didn't recognise it, and I just felt hemmed in. I couldn't, at the particular location, the town that I was working, there weren't really too many other career options. So for me to extract myself out of that, I had to make some serious decisions around uprooting my family and completely changing my career path. And every week I'd look at the Gazette that come out with advertising vacancies, and I was so hungry to, really, my only way of getting out was to transfer and to win a transfer elsewhere. Otherwise, I just felt stuck. But I also felt a sense of, I don't want to show weakness. I don't want people to think I'm copping out, I'm bailing out. I've still got a job to do. The phones keep ringing, the job's still coming in. But there was definitely a period where for that good 18 months, I just felt, look, I need to do something. If I don't do something, something's going to give. Either I'll fall off the perch, or something not good's going to happen. So I made the decision. I finally won a transfer and ended up completely changing my career path. Ended up becoming an instructor at the police academy, transferred, and really that was my lifeline, I think, in terms of changing my negative outlook on life.
And it did change you?
Oh, for sure,
Yep.
for sure. Once I extracted myself out of that, you don't see the forest for the trees until you can actually completely extract yourself out of a certain culture, a certain way of seeing things, the people you're with, and the jobs you're dealing with every day. It wasn't until you completely remove yourself from that I could really see, okay, I'm now in a different workplace. I'm doing a job where I'm training police recruits and first-year constables, and they're so positive and excited, and it really, you can't help but to take on their excitement and positivity, and you have to portray this positivity for the sake of the recruits. So whereas I was becoming bitter and twisted and burnt out old detective sort of thing, I had to change my outlook on life, and it was definitely very positive for me to change.
It's full credit to you that you could, because one of the, and I hate this, where you hear the terminology, the job's fucked. Mm-hmm. And it's usually by disgruntled, burnt out older police that want to impart that on the new police, that the police have come in, as you described, enthusiastic, happy, and then they hit this negative wall of, I wouldn't worry about it, son, or young lady, it's not worth it, the job's fucked.
Yeah, the old TJF.
That's a comment, TJF. So if you hear a police officer saying that, that's what they're referring to. But that negative vibe just creates an environment that's not conducive to good police work.
And what I've experienced is there can be cultures within cultures, and I'm sure you've seen this as well. Within a certain workplace or an office or a station, there can be mini cultures developed over time. People have been there maybe too long, and they've started developing certain practices and attitudes, and you get drawn into that. You just have to sink or swim, and you get easily drawn into that way of thinking. And I'm not saying it was all negative or bad or corrupt or anything like that, but it was just, I guess, people who over time had been worn down by the job, and you can't help but start to take on that negativity.
And become a little bit cynical, and that passes onto a team. In my experience in homicide, going around to different stations, primarily working with detectives officers, but if you had a good detective sergeant in the mix that was enthusiastic, keen and dedicated, you saw it permeated through the whole office, and there might be 20 detectives there. But if you had a disgruntled, feet on the desk and, why bother, we're just banging our head against a brick wall type attitude by a sergeant, that can permeate through the culture of an office or a group of detectives like that. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I think you're right. The detective sergeant rank is so important in terms of being a mentor for the detective senior connies and constables below them. They look at the sergeant as the leader. Yeah. And it's very much about if that detective sergeant has got that positive outlook and that they are a true leader, it will definitely flow onto your more junior staff.
Yeah. So the academy, that is a big change for you. Did you it appears that you enjoyed it, the work that you were doing there. Did you think you were making a difference?
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. It was so weird coming back for the first time as a sergeant. I was at the rank of sergeant by this time, walking back into the academy. And other than going back to the academy to do different courses and things, I really hadn't been back there. Coming back as a staff member was a bit surreal. I remember as a cadet, there'd be the grumpy old sergeant, and I remember this one time his catch cry was, you'd say something to him. So, sorry, sir. And he goes, don't call me sir. I work for a living. Yeah. So we had the old crusty old drill sergeants, and I think things had changed in that time since I come back. It was probably and 18, 19 years later that I came back and I was an instructor at the academy, and certainly the dynamic of the place had changed. But it certainly felt like a very positive place to be, and enthusiasm and positivity, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think it was certainly a saving grace in terms of my long-term career.
I think it's cathartic in a way too. I was never attached to the academy, but I did a lot of lecturing down the academy on homicide investigations or anything related to investigative type police work. And it made you realise how much you've done. Like when you actually standing in front of a class and you think, yeah, you got this imposter syndrome. What am I here for? But when you actually put it in words or in writing, how much you've done and the experience, and you realise that you have done a lot in your career. Did you find that, like, imparting your knowledge in the academy?
Definitely. I think I said when I sat down here in this chair today, I felt like a bit of imposter syndrome. But you forget a lot about.
Don't worry, I'm still confused while I'm doing the podcast. But anyway, let's continue on.
Yeah, because I think coppers are not used to big noting themselves amongst each other.
Yep.
You just do it, you deal with it. We've all done it, so there's no point. There's no competitions, and what other people outside think are really interesting for us is just routine. So you tend to just kind of push it aside and move on to the next job, and they start to accumulate. And when you start teaching in front of a group of fresh-faced recruits or first-year constables, and you do start sharing learnings and experiences, and you think, yeah, well, maybe I do have something to offer. Maybe I have gained some experience that I can share with the junior police.
Yeah, I think I encourage junior police when they have opportunities to lecture or talk in front of groups, and I see their confidence build by the fact that, oh yeah, actually I have got something some knowledge to impart. How long did you stay at the academy for?
I was an instructor there for 4 years.
Yep. So that would have been a different lifestyle. You wouldn't have been on call. You would have been coming home regular hours. You could plan your weekends. Did you become a better father and husband?
Yeah, it's
you might be biased in this answer, but
I might have to ask my wife and my kids. But it was interesting. My kids had never seen me in uniform. I'd been a detective their whole life, and they kind of didn't really understand what I did for a job. They kind of got that I worked at the police station, and when I came home in uniform for the first time, they thought, "Who's this man? What have you done with my father?" But it was good working Monday to Friday, 8 to 4, had my weekends off. I started coaching my kids' soccer and got heavily involved in community work and sport, things that I could never do when I was working shift work as a detective. I started to feel a little bit like a normal person again, having a Monday to Friday job. So I definitely love that.
Part of society, and it's funny that you say become a normal person, because quite often the hours that you work as a detective or you're away, you've been called out, you miss all these opportunities to do that regular thing, like coach a kid's soccer team and do things like that, so you became human again.
Absolutely. And I think of, for those 4 years I was at the police academy, it took me almost that time, maybe a little bit longer, to deal with all my outstanding court cases. As you know, one thing as a detective, you've always got pending court cases, and there was years that I could never even plan to go on holidays without having a district court trial somewhere amongst my holidays, and giving evidence while I was on holidays, and working stupid hours, weekends. It was relentless, and wears away at you.
Well, you just told me something about your career as a detective, because I always worried when I'd speak to detectives and they didn't have much court. I'd be going, hey, if you're a working detective, you're going to be in and out of that witness box. But and that's a pressure position too, isn't it? Giving evidence at a court. Anyone that says they're not nervous before they give evidence is stupid, I think, or ill prepared. How did you find giving evidence at court?
I was always confronting it, and it was always the little things or the jobs where you thought, things aren't as strong as they could be. They're always the ones that bite you on the backside. If you've got a really strong brief and everything's sweet, they usually end up being a plea, and they're easy. It's the ones where, or the ones that you're not prepared for, that suddenly can go bad on you in court, or the defence can start to attack you for certain procedural issues, and you're always second guessing yourself, have I followed correct procedures? And they're the sort of things that the defence will hone in on when you're sitting there squirming, your sphincters puckering in the witness box.
You've described it very well. That's a common feeling in the witness box, and it is pressure. And I find it interesting when I see people, and it's only very rarely, but you see people that experienced barristers, judges, or anyone involved in the justice system, when the tide's turned and they're put in the witness box, and I see how much they crumble under the pressure of answering questions, and they expect police to just get in there and have this brilliant recollection of a decision you made 4 years ago when you've probably been awake for 24 hours and expected to explain.
It's definitely one of the most confronting and nerve-wracking things to have to do is giving evidence in court, particularly if it's your case and you're the arresting officer.
Yeah.
And not only are you there just to give evidence, you're there to assist the prosecutor. So quite
Yeah.
often they might get you to give your evidence first so that you can then sit down and you become the gopher for the prosecutor.
Yeah.
And you're dealing with all your witnesses, and the witnesses have got anxieties, and if your case is heavily reliant upon your witnesses, all that effort that goes into making sure that they're prepared to give evidence. So it's so much more than just you yourself giving your evidence about your what evidence have you gathered and your investigative procedures. So much more to it.
You're quite right, and it just sort of brings it back. We sit here as police and we're saying it's intimidating. Imagine the people that have just been dragged into it through no fault of their own, and all of a sudden they're giving evidence in a very intimidating environment.
And you think, certainly the victims and child victims.
Yeah.
And I had to spend a lot of time working with families and kids, and luckily there was a lot of support agencies that would assist the kids. But that was probably one of the hardest things for me in terms of court, was seeing kids subjected to cross-examination in the witness box, and then losing cases where judges might make a decision that the child wasn't credible or there was not enough corroborating evidence, and in your heart of hearts that you know that child's telling the truth because I interviewed that child, I saw that child crying, I saw what that child had to go through, and then seeing that child subjected to cross-examination in court's quite heartbreaking. Only then to see an acquittal. I've had probably a fair mix of positive and negative results in courts where I've had child sex offenders were found guilty, where our child witnesses gave excellent evidence, and it was you feel so proud of them that they've been able to step up and do that. But it's a very difficult kind of case or type of offence to prove in court sometimes.
Yeah, well, it's quite often one word against the other, and that makes it very difficult. But yeah, just putting your mind to kids that have been assaulted, then it's almost re-traumatising them, putting them through the courts. Have you seen, I think we've identified the problem there, have you seen improvements in the justice system, the way children are treated, giving evidence?
Well, I know there's been changes, say, in the Evidence Act where we can pre-record children's evidence and that video is played as their evidence in chief, but there is still a requirement that they have to be available to be cross-examined, so there's really no way of avoiding that child sitting in the witness box. But there are steps in place where they can put screens up or they can have the defendant removed from the courtroom, so it sort of diminishes that feeling of intimidation while the child's giving evidence in court. They can have support workers with them, so like a counsellor can be with them to offer support. Yeah. Ultimately, though, as much as you put in those supports, that poor child still has to give evidence in court.
Yeah, it's not a perfect system, but we're stuck with it. The type of training you get in child protection. Sorry, I've taken you back out in the academy. You've just found a new life, and I'm dragging you straight back into child protection. So that leading questions aren't asked of children, and that what sort of experience did you have from that making sure that you got a true and accurate account from the children when you were interviewing them?
A lot of the training initially was training on the job. Yep. I remember I was mentored by a female detective, senior constable, and she was a fantastic, experienced child abuse investigator, and I learnt a lot from her sitting in with her interviews. She would often specialise she would interview the child, and then we would go in and interview the suspect. And then over time I started getting more confident at interviewing children myself. And then there's a course that we would do, which is called the ICARE course, ICARE, Interviewing Children and Recording Evidence, which is a 2-week course specifically learning how to interview children in a way that it's done so that it's going to be admissible, or hopefully will be admissible in court. There's so many tricks to not asking leading questions, and you can very easily slip into that. But I think you start to get better once you start listening to yourself. You're sitting in the witness box and you're hearing yourself interviewing a child. That video is being played. You start to think, you start screaming, think, did I really say that? And over time you do get better. But no two child interviews are the same. You just really have to go with the direction the child wants to take you.
Okay. And the personality of the child and the communication skills of the child, you've got to take that all into account.
Yeah, I've seen some of my best witnesses have been 10, 12-year-old, even 8-year-old kids have been fantastic. They're just so blunt. They can articulate precisely their memory. Some people say kids, they get confused or they have poor memories. That's not true.
Like a sponge.
Oh, yeah. And so I've seen some young kids give some fantastic evidence. It can be really tricky, say, if you've got mum is with the child and mum wants to be understandably protective and want to be there with the child. We might have to have a conversation around whether mum or another parent will actually be in the interview. Sometimes children can clam up and may be more forthcoming when mum is not in the interview room.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So you'd have to have that conversation as well around, look, if we feel comfortable that we've built a rapport with this child, that does the child feel comfortable with me, and maybe mum or dad sits outside while we do the interview. And sometimes that works well.
Okay. Back to the academy, 4 years in the academy. Where did you go from there?
So after I left the academy, I did a spell. I started moving into sort of the corporate space for a little while. I worked in the Commissioner's office, sort of strategic policy and operational performance reviews. So I spent some time there. That kind of opened my eyes to more strategic sort of things, rather than when you're at a station, you're focused on your patch and the crime that's going on within your district, whereas this was more from an organisational point of view. So we were briefing the Commissioner around issues that were happening around the state. So that was interesting. And then I got a job working in the police media unit as a media officer. And that really, again, opened up my eyes, because the media office is very busy. It's a very political place to work, where you're putting up political spot fires and you are the voice of the organisation and putting up public messaging. So I learnt a lot about the organisation and the politics of the organisation. When the World Leaders Summit, G20, came into to Brisbane and Queensland, I worked in the G20 command and was all part of the planning and wrote the operational procedures for that. So I started getting into that sort of strategic policy and procedures stuff for a while, and then I came back to police media and got promoted as a senior sergeant, and that's where I saw my time out.
How did you find the transition from, let's call it, operational police officer in the child protection into that area? Did you still find it as rewarding?
Definitely. I mean, I suppose there's still perceptions that you're no longer a real copper because you're not out arresting people. And it took me a while to transition from that, being an operational detective, to working in training and then working in the corporate space and the media space and communications. But I still felt that our job was very much valued by the organisation, and even for the detectives that are out there dealing with frontline stuff and officers around the state, we were supporting them. So I still felt that there was a lot of value to what we were doing.
Yeah, I honestly believe that role is as important as operational policing, and I think the two coexist in an organisation. For the organisation to work effectively, you need those two type of streams. In New South Wales, you probably had it in Queensland. Sarcastically, you'd be referred to as a cake eater. Mm-hmm. And you would have heard the same, because they always seem to be having cakes at morning tea where the operational police are out there doing the work. But it's interesting you said you found that as rewarding, because it's not an area that I went into policing, but I can understand on the bigger picture you can make a difference in that role.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, it was hard because you get a sense sometimes that no matter what you've done or achieved in your prior operational life, everyone forgets that. Yeah. And that you're only judged by the job that you're doing now, even if it's a temporary job working in the Commissioner's office or sitting behind a desk in police headquarters. But I was fortunate that I still got to go out. I did a lot of media training with the detective unit. So the detective training, or the trainee detectives were coming back, and I did a lot of training with them, teaching them how to do a press conference and putting them through their paces. So I felt.
You want to come down to New South Wales?
Yeah. So as you know, that's another skill, standing in front of the cameras and doing a press conference. So I felt that even though I was in the media unit, I fell into a lot of different training roles. So I felt I had an opportunity to still make a difference.
Yeah, and I think the fact that you had that operational experience would have counted. And I know what you're saying. Once you've moved on, it's, nothing more X than an X. Look, you're in there at the Commissioner's office. But it's interesting that you felt that you can contribute. I say this to people with policing, like people identify certain careers in police. The beauty of policing is there's such a broad range of careers, isn't there? Like you could be a tactical police officer, you could work in police rescue, you could even be a highway patrol officer, detective, or you could work in the area that you've described, teaching, and then in the Commissioner's office.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of careers within a career, and that's why I still feel very positive about my career and felt I left on my own terms. And while I was still feeling very positive about it, in fact, I never thought I'd ever leave. I thought I'd do my 40 years and get the gold watch and get bagpiped out of the building. But I guess circumstances changed, and I felt for me it was time to leave. But I look back and think, yeah, I did have an opportunity to have different career paths, reinvent yourself, and do something different, and challenge yourself. And it's all transferable skills.
Okay, so at what point, or what was the tipping point? Was it the fact that you wanted to pursue your passion, the creative writing? What made you leave the police? What made you decide to?
That was certainly a big part of it. I guess I just started feeling I had the realisation that life is short, and I could take the easy option and kind of just stay in cruise control until I turned 60. I was in my early 50s, and do I just follow the easy path and just kind of? I've seen so many people that just kind of coast, they count down the shirts until the day they retire.
It's not good. It's not good for the organisation or the individual, is it?
Yeah. And look, not that I felt that I was bitter and twisted, or I felt that I was dead wood. I felt I was still engaged and productive. But I just had this itch, and it wasn't until I thought, look, I will take a break. I'll take a career break for 12 months and just kind of experience what it's like on the outside. And I use that time to do a lot of reflection around what is it that I want to do with the rest of my life. And I really felt very strongly about. I felt that life had thrown me an opportunity to pursue my writing career, and so ultimately I made that decision.
Okay. At what stage did you take that career break? Was that towards the latter part?
Yeah, towards the latter part. I've been talking about it for a number of years, and it was only towards the latter part that I took that 12 months off, and it was within that time that I decided, yeah, look, I feel comfortable with the decision, and once I had made the decision, I felt like a massive load was off my shoulder, and I felt excited about the future and what the future holds outside the blue uniform.
Yeah, well, taking that 12 months off during my career at a certain stage, I took 12 months leave without pay, and it made me realise that I could exist outside the police. So it sort of prepared me for life outside the police, but also reinvigorated, and I felt like, okay, I'm ready to come back and lock horns again and go hard. But I would encourage that with police that are wondering what they're doing with their career. If the opportunity presents itself and you can do something, have a break from it, and that gives you a perspective. Because I see a lot of people leave police midway through their career or at certain stages because they're just, like you were at Child Protection, just had enough of it, too much darkness and all that, and the only alternative they could see is just walk away from it completely. But if you could just stop, take a step back, it's worthwhile.
Yeah, the introduction of the unpaid career break was great. I think the organisation saw that they were losing people for that reason, that people were getting burnt out.
Yeah.
So it gave you a bit of a lifeline. You could go out and explore. Some coppers went out and drove trucks or had other jobs, and for me it was an opportunity just to see what life is like. Again, having been institutionalised since I was 17 years of age, just to see what the world is like on the outside. So, and some people just decide, no, look, I want to come back. It's policing's in my veins, and it's what I want to do. I've enjoyed the break, but for me, I thought, no, it has piqued my interest to see what else life is offering. Because what I did discover is, I very quickly picked up work delivering training in investigations with a training company. The skills that we learn as police are very sought after and highly valued outside.
Yeah, I think people are becoming more aware of that. But it's interesting that you've used it a couple of times, institutionalised. I know what you mean. It's just, I'm a policeman. This is what I do. Okay, a boss is going to tell me to do this. I'm going to tell people. You do just become part of an organisation, don't you?
Yeah, and it defines who you are. You don't say to people, "I do police work."
Yeah.
I am a policeman. Yeah. It's a police officer. It defines who you are.
Well, I've heard army blokes say, we're talking about that when you're leaving policing or military or that, you join the army, you join the police. There's not a lot of other professions that you join. But just the terminology, you've joined, so you're part of this organisation. So to walk away from it. We're going to have a break now. When we get back, we're going to talk about your fictional crime writing, and I'm very interested in your take on it because it's something that just fascinates people, and that's obviously what you've found with your books. But the world of crime just seems to be people's interest in it is insatiable.
Yeah, it's an area that people are just intrigued with.
Yeah. Okay. So when we get back, we're going to talk about that and a few other things. So
see you then.
Cheers.